Carey, welcome to How the Light Gets In.
Thank you.
So one of the things you said is that no one wants to admit that race is real. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think that in the era of social constructionism, people have thought that race is an illusion, something that can be admitted or not admitted, talked about or not spoken about, and somehow that decreases its power. When I say that people don't think that it's real, they don't think that it organizes society, that it affects the way that people perceive the world, that in many ways it determines the life course of people who are affected by race, whether or not you're white, black, Asian, indigenous, Hispanic, Latino, etc., very much affects the course of your life trajectory, even your life expectancy in some cases. And I think particularly in the UK, that seems to have a cultural predilection towards color-blindness. It's a very dangerous habit because it assumes that the failures of certain groups of people are based on collective individual pathologies, that these are individuals choosing to not succeed, choosing to endorse the wrong kinds of values, rather than seeing how certain structures, forms of education, economic and political barriers obscure the ability of people to not only see and pursue certain courses of life and action, but also become rewarded as their white counterparts for getting the same kind of education or the same kind of jobs.
So is it then connected to this distinction that people sometimes make between whether race is a sort of structural social problem and an institutional problem versus whether race is as you said, a sort of fault of certain individuals who just need to be therapized out of their biases?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And I think this is what you'll find when you read something like the Black radical tradition or critical race theory or even Afro-pessimism, contemporary Black theory about racism versus, mainstream liberal theory. Liberal theory suggests that race or racism is an individual bias, is a cognitive prejudice that people have, that they read people based on skin color and not who they are as autonomous, free, rational individuals. So in that sense, people say, well, look, this is something that we need to adjust people's mindsets or their psychologies from, which is why most of the decolonization discussion in the UK focuses on how you make white people better people. How do you allow white people to see diversity and see that there's different colors of people and complexions that have contributed to world history? When you're looking at Black intellectual traditions, you're looking at racism as a form of dehumanization, as a process that's been engaged upon deliberately by European countries, by nations, by structures, by institutions, meant to denigrate and exploit certain groups of people for the benefit of the white race. And it's that kind of distinction between people who experience racism and develop theories to talk concretely about what it is, how it acts, how it affects people that are burdened with racialization, and then white liberals who think often that, oh, well, it's just about me endorsing the right kind of Black person or recognizing that Black people are human beings. This is the chasm, so to speak, between how we understand racism as a structural, cultural, and historical process and racism merely as an individual bias.
Another kind of approach to thinking about race is intersectionality.
Yes.
And it's the idea that we only really understand race through this kind of overlap with other identities like gender or class. And that's where the true nature and extent of different forms of oppression become visible. You've been a critic of some of those approaches. Mm-hmm. What's your thought? Why do you think that approach is also problematic?
Well, I mean, there's so much to say about that. I think from a historical perspective, we often ignore that the rubric of anti-discrimination law in the United States that intersectionality is based on, which is largely Title VII jurisprudence, is a contingent and constructed phenomena. The addition of sex to Title VII jurisprudence and legislation was the effect of the National Women's Party, a conservative feminist organization, actually trying to stop Title VII legislation from benefiting Black people. So in order to kill the legislation, they said, let's introduce sex to the debates. So the congressional debates show that they thought they were going to stop Black civil rights gains, affirmative action, et cetera, but ended up adding sex and then redistributing the economic benefits like affirmative action, entrance into college, et cetera, from Black people who had marched during the civil rights and died for those rights to white women. That's why we see that after the 1960s and 70s, the primary beneficiaries of affirmative action were white women, not the Black people who marched and fought for civil rights in the United States. Now, taking that as a historical backdrop, you ask yourself, what does adding sex, a contingent and really subversive category in Title VII legislation, actually do to the identities of people who suffer? Well, for a long time, black people weren't understood to have gender. They weren't recognized as men and women. Most infamously, you see the protests where black men were marching, "I am a man," largely because black men were still referred to as boys, especially in the part of the country in the United States that I'm from. So when we ask ourselves, well, there's intersectional identities, well, what do those intersectional identities mean? We're reading history backwards, anachronistically. We're assuming that the identities of man, woman, male, female, masculinity, and feminine apply to all racial groups the same way throughout history. So you take intersectionality as a concept in the 1980s and you read it all the way back to the 1860s when black people were thought to be animals. You know, it's this kind of lazy intellectualism that I have a problem with, because we'll adamantly state that black people weren't seen as humans, but somehow we believe that people respected their sexual orientation and their gender identities. That seems almost silly when you say it that way, but it occupies a central place in how most intellectuals try to reread and revise history to fit the idea of the theory. I think one of the most impactful criticisms that I have of intersectionality is just many of the intuitions we have about it are false. So when you say things like race plus class plus gender, you have to really ask yourself, what constitutes the category? If you're thinking about combining race and gender and you think gender is woman, you have to start asking yourself very empirical questions. Well, what does that mean? Historically, that's meant that the idea that black women seem to suffer both from racism and sexism, and that they suffer from double jeopardy, meaning that they usually endure worse effects than black men or their male counterparts. But when we look at the empirical evidence, we find that's largely untrue. So if you look at police killings, for instance, we find that femininity actually devoids some of the animus that white people feel towards black targets. When you look at things like economic progress or education, we see that black women have slight advantages in those areas. In fact, when you look at the category of race itself, we find that most racist stereotypes are attached to how white people or dominant groups view the males of that particular racial or ethnic group. And this is what black male studies scholars mean when they say racism is misandric aggression. Racism is primarily a form of discrimination and violence that aims to target or eliminate males of a certain racial or ethnic subordinate group. So if we take the social scientific research into account, we don't get the intuitive, the obviousness, right, that intersectionality theorists claims exist when you utilize their ideas or utilize their methods.
On the other hand, it sounds like you want in some ways to reappropriate intersectionality or direct it in a different direction by thinking of how black male identity in particular plays a role. And some feminist scholars have criticized you for doing this, for reappropriating, as it were, this concept of intersectionality when writing about the racism faced by black males in particular and how different that is from the racism faced by black women.
Sure.
So what do you make of that critique, and can you tell us about how you are trying to kind of think of gender, male gender, in relation to race here?
Yeah, I always find that an interesting critique, because I think for some intersectionality theorists, there is no outside of intersectionality. Even the criticisms of intersectionality become intersectionality at some point. And I think one of the most obvious examples of that is Peter Kwan's analysis of a co-synthesis theory. A few decades ago, Peter Kwan suggested that the problem with intersectionality is that even though it claimed that it was against essentialism, it essentializes race and gender into the idea of the black female subject. And he says, well, how is that useful if we're trying to utilize abstract categories to speak about different aspects or variations of identity and social position? So he makes this criticism in his article on co-synthesis. A few years later, suddenly intersectionality becomes that. Athena Matua says this is one of the strengths as well as infinite weaknesses of the theory, is that any criticism inevitably becomes the theory. And in my work, this is what I meant about the ad hoc nature of intersectionality. That anytime I disprove something empirically or historically show, for instance, that many of the claims that intersectionality makes about race and class and gender and poverty and maleness, et cetera, or even violence, can be traced not to black feminist ideology or theory, but could also be aligned with subcultural violence theory from white racist criminologists and sociologists. Would we make the same claim that subcultural violence theory, authored by Wolfgang and Farah Kuti, or the student Minicha Mamir, is in fact intersectionality? So I think that's my response to the feminists who make this claim, is the idea of black people studying the relationship between racism and, sexism or sexual violence and poverty is nothing new. It's just that we've been caught into a name because we've attached it to a certain kind of progressive language. I mean, certainly we wouldn't be as silly to think that black people only focused on blackness with no relationship or understanding of, say, religion or nation right? These were the very debates that you had between Stokely Carmichael and Martin Luther King, the role of poverty and militarism, right? Location in the application of racism. So the idea that black people have never thought in multiple terms and only thought of blackness is a part of the intersectional historiography that I find is false. But more importantly, I think that the people claiming that black male studies, or even my work, is trying to reappropriate intersectionality are sorely mistaken, because what I'm saying is we've always thought in expansive terms. And only when we started talking about racial identity in the post-civil rights era, when we're thinking about things like discrimination and not colonialism, does it become a question of how we're identifying certain parts. Black male studies is making the argument that black men aren't so much of an identity as a caricaturized population. So if you think about this from the aspect of genocide studies, right? Would we say that Jewish men in the Holocaust had a male privilege because they were the victims of extermination, say, first? Because we know in genocides, generally you have a gendercidal moment where you kill civilian aged men, 15 to 55, and then you pursue root and branch killings. This is basically the pattern of 20th century genocidal violence. Is there male privilege there? Because they were the first victims. You see, it almost seems silly, if not offensive, to suggest people who were targeted for discrimination and elimination fundamentally have privileges amongst themselves. But when we talk about black people, we seem to be able to attribute all forms of privilege, intentionality, and agency, even under the most degrading conditions. So intersectionality wants to look at, say, poverty, people who are mired in situations of catastrophe and violence, and then point out that the people who commit violence because they lack employment, education, social mobility, etc., are emphasizing or acting on male privilege. See, to me, that seems nonsensical, because when you look at the antecedents that cause violence, intersectionality comes up short in terms of what it perceives. So to say that a view or a theory that's looking at social determinants of violence, what causes intra-group violence, what causes dehumanization, is the same things as the categories that can be reduced down to maleness and blackness, sorely misunderstand the depth of and complexity of oppression.
And can you say a little bit about the ways in which kind of black male identity has been caricatured, as you said, and used to sort of stigmatize and create these harmful stereotypes? You talk about hypermasculinity, hypersexuality in your work.
No, absolutely. I think there's a few things. One is that black male studies is looking at black men as a population, not necessarily an enduring identity. So when I say that, what I mean to convey is, when you look at historical processes of genocide, low-level conflict, or even racial conflicts throughout the world, throughout the 19th and 20th century, what you find are caricatures of racialized men. You see this in the Holocaust with Nazis propaganda. It was Jewish men who were thought to be devils and animals and beasts. You find very few, hardly any references to women or have women depicted in that way. You see the same thing during 19th century ethnology, because ethnology was a study of the organization and hierarchy of races based on the status of their men. You see all kinds of caricatures and writings about black men as demons, animals, beasts, snakes, etc., as a representation of the lowly nature and the evilness that the black race held. So given that, black men then epitomize in our modern day this process of racial caricaturization that legitimated violence, genocidal violence at sometimes, and really do mark the process of dehumanization. So today we see this with black men in terms of the threat they pose to women and children in their own group. We always look to really decontextualize statistics of domestic violence in the black community, or homicides, talk about how violent black men are, and by effect, how causally violent black masculinity is. We see this in arguments about black men not succeeding in universities and colleges, pursuing their street life rather than, a life of books and higher reflection. All of this is based not on the fact that we're actually observing sociological phenomena, but we're using decadent and racist theories which hold that black men have lower IQs than their white counterparts and their female counterpart to explain why we think they turn to a culture and practice of deviance. Hypersexuality, hypermasculinity, these ideas that black men are not balanced, they're not mature, they're not developed, that they're always in some excess, be it predatory or be it savage and primitive, that explains why they have such a lowly position in terms of criminality, deviance, and downward mobility compared to their female counterpart in whites. These theories are trying to explain why populations don't have the same status of civility and humanity that others do. And when we frame it merely as a problem of identity, I think we often miss the historical processes that are involved not only with black men as a specific case study, but racialized men generally throughout the history of imperialism, colonialism, and patriarchal dominance.
So one of the approaches to studying race that does employ this kind of historical method to some extent, and the kind of looking at material conditions and not just at the kind of ideas of identity that can become a bit rarefied, is critical race theory.
Yes, yes.
What do you make of the fact that the right is so afraid of school children and university students learning about critical race theory? And on the other hand, what do you make of liberals defending critical race theory as they understand it?
Yes.
And the question is, do they really understand what it means?
Yes. Well, I'll start with the latter question first. Liberals defend critical race theory because they identify critical race theory largely with intersectionality. They see critical race theory as an invitation to discuss and form coalitions with certain members of minority populations. As I've pointed out in my work, and even through the research of other scholars, those relationships and coalitions are contingent, largely on a broad understanding of feminist ideology, and are largely exclusive of men of racial and ethnic backgrounds. So the intersectional idea that they have of critical race theory is one that furthers what they take to be reformism and maintains the core tenets of liberalism. Critical race theory from the racial realist tradition, the tradition solidified by people like Derek Bell, Linda Green, Kenneth Nunn, Richard Delganos, Jane Stefanczyk, right? These scholars are making vastly different arguments where they're criticizing liberalism, where they're criticizing the very ability of white liberals to understand and actually participate in revolutionary anti-racist practices or fundamentally challenge the organization of society given that it's ordained by the rule of law. That's why their work reads as much more antagonistic to the liberal tradition. In Gary Peeler's book, Race Consciousness, he actually makes this claim very clear, that to the white liberal, the white supremacists and the black nationalists who fight in white supremacy are basically the same, because the evaluation of whether or not one is racist or nationalistic isn't on whether or not they're fighting injustice or justice, but whether or not they take the race consciousness, the race characteristic like blackness or whiteness, to be a fundamental part of their identity and their political motivations. Well, if you're looking at black nationalists who take blackness seriously precisely because it stands outside of a white supremacist logic, then the white liberal looks at them and says they're just as bad as the KKK that's killing, lynching, and murdering people. But if you're looking at black nationalism within a structural and material basis, then you're saying, well, this grew as a response to the oppressive conditions that white liberals are safe from but complacent in, that allow black people to be killed, oppressed, lynched, etc. And that's going to be the biggest difference between how black intellectuals and black radicals understand their position within a white supremacist empire, logic, or society versus how white liberals, who very much stand on the sidelines and comment on the moral rightness of the people participating in the conflict, evaluate the situation. Now, conservatives are quite a different story, because conservatives, especially in the United States, fundamentally believe that the values, the structure, and the empire that makes up the United States are correct and ordained by God. So America is the providence of God's will, so to speak. It is the promise and will for civilization to be led by that country and by the set of values that established it. Critical race theorists will never be popular with conservatives any more than black people will be popular with white supremacists. The idea that the conservative has is that teaching anti-patriotic ideas, the history of racism, the history of slavery, the processes of colonialism, the role that capitalism has as being infused with the bodies and bloods of black people, those are unacceptable conversations because it sullies, it stains the ability of the white nation to believe that it was truly in the right. So those conversations aren't to be debated, they're to be censored. So the right's approach to censoring critical race theory is largely a project that started years ago, even when I had the blow up at Texas A&M, where the right understood that American colleges and American campuses were actually breeding grounds for what they take to be leftist ideology. Really, they frame leftism as Marxism, but nonetheless, they see this as running throughout feminism and throughout critical race theory and black studies. So their approach, which is logical if you're a white supremacist or you want to maintain the kind of sanctity of the American Republic, is let's start making these about what we're teaching in schools, universities, and colleges. And to do that, they say we're going to start banning conversations about black history in primary school education. So that means that when people go to college, there's not going to be a push for it. and we're going to start censoring and punishing state institutions that are going to utilize state money and state funds to teach these radical black ideologies. Now, the effect of that, of course, is there's going to be a collective forgetting of the kinds of progress that we think that black studies or the election with Obama, even if you're a good liberal, or even conversations about race have done to move white people from, say, the moderate center to the progressive left. But because there's such a strong reaction now, one of the things that people misunderstand about critical race theory is that the attacks on critical race theory and the censorship of critical race theory also expands the platform for the right. So now it becomes okay to be racist. It becomes okay to believe in an American imperialism and a romantic American, colonial empire legacy, very much like Britain's, right? Past Britannica. So now that these things are okay, you're going to see more and more resistance because it's going to grow and it's going to, fertilize an intellectual culture where white people are going to feel quite secure in both upholding and defending a version of whiteness that's linked to genocides, enslavement, and the continuing murder of black people in the United States.
So in some ways, both the conservatives and the liberals, for their own personal reasons, misunderstand what critical race theory is ultimately about.
Of course. But in all honesty, most of the engagements that I've seen about black thought, both in the United States by white liberals and in the UK, isn't based on them reading black people. One of the most embarrassing and racist aspects of how people are approaching this question of critical race theory or even decoloniality or even black male studies for that instance is they don't find themselves compelled to actually read black authors. So much of what they understand on both the right and the left as critical race theory comes from pop culture, the ability of black thinkers to, mobilize their ideas on radio waves and on YouTube. The celebrity culture of the United States is really a marker for who white liberals are listening to, not a marker of who's doing the most rigorous research that can be verified and validated time after time. The weakness of that is that since the standards of black intellectual acceptance are so vastly different from white intellectual acceptance, which is based on research, peer review, et cetera, is that you're trying to basically convince and sell your ideas to a white liberal audience for their adoption. And that's going to be vastly distant from what working class black people actually believe and how working class black people who suffer from police brutality, oppression, the primary targets of racism and discrimination actually experience the world.
Let's go back to liberals for a moment
and
the reason why they find critical race theory or the real concept of critical race theory may be hard to accept. I know this is a quote that's often taken out of context by Derek Bell, but in some ways it reflects this idea that the very structures, institutions, legal frameworks of the United States have racism somehow inbuilt in them. And so sort of getting rid of that is not very realistic unless you kind of undo the whole institutional structure.
Yes.
I guess the question that liberals might ask is like, okay, what do we do with this diagnosis? Like if we still want to somehow make society less racist, improve the livelihood and the quality of life of black people in America and in the UK, is anything short of undoing our institutions, kind of pointless? What are the solutions?
Well, to be quite honest with you, it depends on their true understanding of the diagnosis, right? Many people evaluate Bell's claim of racial realism, which is really the kind of product of his racism is permanent thesis, merely as a rhetorical and pessimistic doctrine. But I would urge people to really read what he's saying because he's utilizing semi-colonial analysis. He's arguing that black people in the United States are basically an internalized colony who are economically exploited and never fully participate or have the guarantees of civil and human rights. If you take that picture of reality, then it would seem that people that are meant to be used for labor are deemed expendable for your political projects and interests. Of course, they wouldn't be ever able to be fully incorporated into the Republic. Now, other scholars like Jim Sedanius and Felicia Prado have made similar diagnoses looking at the evaluation or the construction of hierarchies within white supremacist capitalistic societies, right, with capitalist surplus. They've come to the exact same conclusion. And they're using economics and psychology to not only talk about the mindset that dominant groups have of the outgroup, but also how hierarchies are constantly built up and reified, both in terms of ideology and belief systems and in terms of capital acquisition. So if you think about a world where the dominant in-group, in the case of the United States and the UK, white people, will construct their identity and organize their society to extract resources from those people who are poor to sustain their own group's interest in existence, then one would ask the question, well, how then do you undo that if you don't undo the structures of economics, education, government, et cetera, that keep these dynamics alive? So I often think that the white liberal and the progressive believe so strongly in the moral force of their ideas that they overlook the material. They overlook what the social scientific evidence points them to. And because that's such a fate that they don't want to endure, having their world undone, they say, well, it becomes impossible or fatalistic. But we have to think of it in this way. Black people have endured enslavement. They've been through several acts of genocide when we look throughout Africa and the diaspora, and they still struggle against these colonial and neo-colonial apparatus. They fought against apartheid and brought about a post-apartheid. So the question of what can be done or a solution doesn't seem to be a problem for the people who are oppressed. It seems to be a problem for the consciousness of the people who want to endure the same economic and political privileges of a system built on unjust enrichment in relationship to a group of people who are trying to tear it down precisely because those structures bring about oppression, suffering, and tyranny. So when we ask that larger question about what's to be done, I think we really have to kind of humble ourselves next to the traditions of struggle and protest that every other oppressed group seems to be able to find and muster throughout several centuries versus the white liberal who wants a quick fix-all. And this dynamic, right? This dynamic of violence, this dynamic of murder is exactly what Black male studies is highlighting. Black male studies starts from this kind of pessimistic rendering. It just asks a different question. Whereas intersectionality's political solution is, let's join together to the exclusion of these nationalistic Black men who have been targeted by the state. Black male studies says, well, what is the state's relationship to imposing genocidal violence on members of the certain racial or ethnic male group? Because those usually are the most radical groups. Why then do patriarchies target racialized men so strongly if they're actually part of the patriarchal order themselves, right? Notice, all the members of the Black Panther Party, Black civil rights organizations, all the Black radicals of the 1960s and 70s were killed by the state. They were criminalized by the state. Even with Black Lives Matter, they created the term Black identity extremists. They didn't go arrest the Black women. They arrested and killed Black men. So ask yourself this question. If Black men really do function as part of a structure that recognizes and accepts their maleness and their patriarchal potential, why does it take such great efforts to criminalize and demonize and kill them in every struggle people have for racial revolution and freedom? See, the continuum that we have about pessimism, or Derek Bell's proclamation, is evidenced by the way that violence is divvied out amongst oppressed people. Who gets killed? Who dies? Why do you sterilize Black women? You sterilize them so you don't have more Black men and boys. Why do you fear Black men and boys? Well, their militancy, their revolutionary thinking, the pure threat that they biologically and culturally have to the dominance of the white race. This is why they pass anti-miscegenation laws. Why do you have such negative caricatures of Muslim men, Black men, Jewish men, Armenian men, African men, Mexican men, right? There's a repetitive process here that we refuse to see because we're so clouded by our politics, by our liberalism, by our feminism, by our gender theory, that we don't want to see that the ways that people are dominated and colonized and exterminated from the face of the world largely depends on how they eliminate, target, and demonize their men. And I think that what we need now is a much broader intellectual and empirical basis for studying racism that moves us beyond the question of whether or not white people could be morally swayed out of acting like white people and enacting violence or even indifference towards the suffering of everyone else.
Tommy Carey, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For more debates, talks, and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.